Welcome, everyone. Thank you for spending your lunchtime with us here on a really hot, rainy day in New Orleans, like they all tend to be in August. Uh, we're just finishing up our World War II challenge, the Operation Liberty Road, Operation Pacific Theater. This was the virtual run where you're able to accumulate distance and unlock points along Patton's route across Europe, or the island hopping campaign in the Pacific. And my name's Nathan Hegan. I'm the Director of Educational Travel at the National World War II Museum. Normally I'd be putting together tours, but I've spent the last 18 months putting together virtual events like this run. And our last event that goes along with this is a look at the liberation of the Philippines and the Battle of Manila. And it's something that really came to the forefront in the study of World War II in 2018 with the release of James Scott's book, Rampage, Macarthur, Yamashita, and the Battle of Manila. I've been fortunate enough to travel to the Philippines several times and meet some representatives of the Philippine World War II Memorial Foundation, to see some of the sites that are still there, to see the changes that Manila has gone through in the last 75 plus years. And when you're studying World War II in the Philippines, when you're visiting, it seems that there's always something new to uncover, something new to study. And James Scott's going to do a fantastic job for us of telling little bits of those stories that went into the writing of his book, Rampage. And with that, I'll turn it over to James. He's done one of these with us already, focusing on the Marianas Islands, but James, I'll turn it over to you, and I know you've got a big grouping of pictures that you're going to share with us.
Great, Nathan, thanks so much, and thanks everybody for tuning in on your lunch hour today. I'm going to do the share screen here, and let's see if that will work. All right, do you guys see the actual slide? I'm assuming good. So as Nathan said, we're going to talk a little bit about the Battle of Manila today, which was really the only major urban fight of the Pacific War, and was an incredibly violent one at that. But I think to truly sort of appreciate the Battle of Manila and sort of the tragedy of it, it's important for us to sort of rewind to the turn of the 20th century. And when the United States had captured the Philippines during the Spanish-American War, now the U.S. ended up hiring famed municipal architect Daniel Burnham, who, if anybody's ever been up to in DC, you've seen the National Mall. Well, he did the redesign of it in the early 1900s. He also was the architect who did Union Station, which is the big transit terminal there at Capitol Hill. If you've been up to New York and seen the Flatiron Building, that's his handiwork as well. So he was a pretty legendary figure. And the United States brought him in the early 1900s with the idea that they could transform Manila into really an American city in Asia, if you will. And so it was his job to help plan Manila, one that would ultimately, help project America's growing global status around the world and whatnot. And so in the 4 decades leading up to World War II, Manila, in fact, did develop into this great small slice of America, home not only to thousands of service members, but also employees of companies like General Electric, Del Monte, and B.F. Goodrich. Many of these folks, you can actually see, these are some great historic photos I actually found in our National Archives. You can see here Heacock Department Store, which was the really sort of one of the grand shopping spots right in Manila in the early 1900s. Those residents also like to wander down the Escolta, which is still there today in Manila. It was dubbed the Fifth Avenue of Manila, and it was really sort of one of the grand shopping streets, as you can imagine, there in the Philippines. Often called the Pearl of the Orient, Manila boasted a great quality of life, with social clubs and movie theaters, golf courses, tennis courts, and swimming pools. The New York Times actually said it best when it described Manila in 1932. Quote, "Manila is by far the most beautiful of all cities in the Orient. From the top of the University Club, it seems half hidden in a canopy of trees, green everywhere, a city within a park." Manila also boasted a rich history stretching back more than 4 centuries, with a wonderful mix of culture, Filipinos, Spanish, Chinese, and Americans. During that early 1900s, a lot of new architecture sprang up around the city, including Philippines General Hospital, which is pictured here. And it was designed, as you can see, in the California Mission style that was popular at that time. If you've been out to like Stanford and Palo Alto, it very much echoes that same type of architecture. This is actually a photograph of the interior courtyard of PGH. And I love this image. You can actually see the men and women in hats and with parasols. Again, PGH is still there in Manila today. You can go and you can wander around inside this courtyard. It was also seen during the Battle of Manila of some of the most incredible fighting as well. Few buildings, however, could really rival the luxurious Manila Hotel, which opened its doors in 1911. It was also built in the California mission style architecture. The only difference was that it had green roof tiles instead of red. It also would be later, the penthouse of this hotel would also later be the home of Douglas MacArthur, his wife, and their young son, who would live there all the way up until the outbreak of World War II. To live in Manila in 1941, remembered CBS News correspondent Bill Dunn was to experience the good life. But of course, the good life ended on December 7th, 1941, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor and invaded the Philippines soon thereafter. This is a photograph here of Cavite Naval Base, which was one of the first victims of Japanese attacks. American and Filipino forces fell back to the Bataan Peninsula and the fortified island of Corregidor to hold off the Japanese. But that effort was ultimately doomed, leading to the notorious Bataan Death March, followed by years of suffering and horrendous prisoner of war camps. This is actually a photograph of from the Bataan Death March. Manila suffered greatly during those 3 years of Japan's occupation. Japanese officers seized homes and cars from residents. Others looted food supplies and pharmacies, department stores. They stole farm equipment and they left fields to rot. As a result, store shelves sat empty, basic supplies vanished. Felipe Buencamino, writing in his diary at the time, captured the frustration of many of the folks in the Philippines when he wrote, quote, "What kind of an army is this that fights a war with pianos and nice residences?" As the years passed, Manila's economy collapsed and the social fabric of the city began to unravel. Families unable to care for their children went so far as to abandon them to orphanages or even sell them. Starvation, meanwhile, ran rampant, claiming as many as 500 lives a day in Manila. As a result, an army of beggars flooded the streets. Marcial Achauca, who was a Manila attorney and who captured a lot of this frustration in his diary, said it best in a December 1944 entry when he said, quote, "Today we are living under conditions under which only the fittest among us could hope to survive." Now, literally so many American families who were caught at the outbreak of the war in the Philippines and of course couldn't get out were interned at the University of Santo Tomas. And for those 3 years, over about 3,700 Americans lived there on a 50-acre college campus right in the heart of Manila. Just like everybody else outside in the city, those families likewise suffered. You can see from this photograph here, these 5 gentlemen lost a combined total of 278 pounds. A medical survey conducted in January of 1945 revealed that the average male internee lost 51 pounds during that time period. The average female, 32. To survive, these desperate internees ate dogs, cats, pigeons, and even rats, which cost about 8 pesos each on the camp's black market. Others resorted to thievery, including the plundering of graves in search of jewelry, dentures, eyeglasses, even clothing. Anything that could be bartered or sold to buy a fistful of rice. Carmen Guerrero Nakpil, who's a famous writer in the Philippines during that time period, summed it up best when she wrote, quote, "We survived by means of savage and ardent cunning. We became a race of spies, thieves, saboteurs, informers, and looters, callous and miserly." The promise of an end to that long national nightmare finally came on January 9th, 1945, when MacArthur's forces landed on the beaches of Lingayen Gulf, which is on the northern end of the island of Luzon, which is sort of the main island of the Philippines. It's sort of the political and cultural heart of the Philippines. 3 weeks later, American forces rolled, on February 3rd, 1945, American forces rolled into Manila. Excitement over America's arrival, however, proved short-lived. The Same day that the Americans reached Manila, Japanese Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi, who was in charge of the Manila Naval Defense Forces, gave the order to begin the planned destruction of the city. Incendiary squads swept through the districts north of the Pasig River, which bisected Manila, and began setting fire to businesses and homes. Manila residents grabbed what belongings they could carry and fled. General Robert Baitler, commander of the 37th Infantry, described it best in his report when he said, quote, "We were powerless to stop it. We had no way of knowing in which of the thousands of places the demolitions were being controlled. Big, modern, reinforced concrete and steel office buildings were literally blown from their foundations to settle crazily in twisted heaps." MacArthur's personal pilot, Dusty Rhodes, witnessed the scene from the air. Quote, "The spectacle was an appalling sight," he wrote in his diary. The entire downtown section of the city was a mass of flames rising 200 feet in the air. In addition, the Japanese blew all the bridges over the Pasig River, which divided the city. And after destroying the city's northern districts, Japanese troops fell back across the river into central Manila, forcing American troops to begin what would prove to be an incredibly bloody fight to retake the heart of the Pearl of the Orient. To make it harder for the advancing Americans, the Japanese barricaded more than 50 intersections in central Manila, like this one you see here, which is the corner of Dart and Oregon streets. To fortify this, they literally took oil drums, filled them with concrete. They sunk railroad axles in the ground, right side up. They even used landmines and beach mines as sort of improvised explosive devices, all of which was covered by a pillbox you can see in the top right-hand corner. This is actually a photograph of another such intersection that kind of gives you a real-life visual of the map we just saw. Here you can see two truck bodies sort of turned on their side. They're wired together and they're anchored. You can see with a cable in the tree on the right. You can also see here the poles that are sunk upright into the street. And again, all of this is designed to slow the advancing American forces. Just as perilous, of course, were the fortified buildings. Japanese Marines used the higher floors to target the Americans, dropping Molotov cocktails and shooting down on them as well. Quote, "The preferred solution was to use cannons to blast the upper floors to rubble and then move in," one infantry officer said. An equally favored alternative was to burn the building. When these alternatives wouldn't work, riflemen had no choice but to go in and retake the building floor by floor. Between the Japanese demolitions and the American artillery, Manila was literally being destroyed from the inside and the out. Men, women, and children who were able had no choice but to flee. Others retreated below ground, where conditions inside cramped air raid shelters devolved as the hours turned to days. Bunkers built to house an entire family, often held multiple families. So you can imagine sort of the crowded, hot conditions for days on end living below ground. Such shelters also proved easy targets for marauding Japanese troops who often tossed hand grenades inside. That was the case for the gentleman here. You can see his cheek has literally been ripped off from shrapnel from a grenade. Many of those who were injured proved unable to walk, including this woman in this photograph here, who had to be placed in a basket for transportation to an aid station by some of her neighbors. It was during this time that some of the worst atrocities took place, as the Japanese began slaughtering literally thousands of residents in places ranging from the German Club, which was a big social hall in downtown Manila, to St. Paul's College, to De La Salle, and even the old walled city of Intramuros. The Pearl of the Orient, literally day by day, hour by hour, was being destroyed. And this photograph here is an incredible image. It gives you just a sense of just the massive amount of firepower and destruction suffered by Manila. By the morning of February 23rd, American forces had isolated the last of the Japanese troops inside the old walled city of Intramuros and a handful of surrounding government buildings. The fight to retake the walled city, which is, just so you know, is about 160 acres, sort of surrounded by towering walls, some of them as much as 20 feet thick, 20 feet high. The fight to retake it began February 23rd with an artillery barrage at 7:30 that morning. literally one so violent and destructive that it darkened the skies over Manila, turning day into night. Assault troops moved in, fighting amid the rubble using flamethrowers, which proved to be one of the more popular weapons in the fight that took place inside buildings and passageways. Once inside the old walled city, troops discovered that the survivors were mostly women and children. Japanese actually killed many of the men in the days leading up to the final assault there. In fact, war crimes investigators later estimated that the total was about 4,000 victims just inside the walled city. With the walled city finally secured, American troops moved on to the handful of government buildings that surrounded it that were still being used by the Japanese. These were buildings that had been built by the Americans during the interwar periods for the years leading up to World War II. These were concrete and steel reinforced buildings. They were designed to withstand earthquakes and typhoons. And as you can imagine, they were essentially small fortresses. And so it required a massive amount of artillery and fire for the United States to be able to take them. The fight, therefore, to retake the Philippine capital finally ended on March 3rd, 1945, led to the deaths of 16,665 Japanese troops. America suffered about 1,000 killed and more than 5,500 wounded. But it was the civilians that really bore the brunt of the horror, with an estimated 100,000 killed, many of them in atrocities committed by the Japanese. Of course, over the city of Manila hung that awful stench of death. Worse than that smell was the taste of death, as Infantry Major Chuck Henn remembered. He said, quote, "No amount of spitting," he recalled, "could clear that taste away." The Battle of Manila had destroyed 613 city blocks, an area comprised of 11,000 buildings, banks, schools, churches, offices. More than 200,000 residents were left homeless. This is actually a photograph of the General Post Office, and it's still there today. Actually, it's been sort of rehabbed and back in use in Manila today. This is actually a photograph here of City Hall, and I think this photograph really just gives you a sense of just the awesome firepower that was used during the Battle of Manila. A post-war American survey estimated that the damage to Manila by today's figures would cost about $10 billion. It's a price tag that in the end, neither the United States nor Japan really wanted to ultimately pay. And beyond structural losses, of course, were the cultural ones, from historic churches and museum paintings, statues, priceless literary works. The Battle of Manila, in many ways, even though it was only 29 days long, really robbed the Philippines of much of its cultural heritage, all of it just reduced to ashes there in the rubble. And of course, the economy was in shambles. Sentiment best described by one of the Santo Tomas internees, Abraham Hartendorp. He said, quote, "The manager of one of the Manila oil companies, in speaking of rebuilding his plant, stated that he would have to begin again at the beginning with a land survey." More than anything, however, was the incalculable loss to the nation's precious human capital. The doctors, the lawyers, the teachers, the inventors, the moms and the dads. The Battle of Manila had a wide-ranging impact on the Philippines and its people. Gone was the Pearly Orient, the gorgeous city that had once graced tourism brochures and steamship ads. Gone were so many people's lives, families wrecked, futures upended. And of course, so many others would have no choice in the end but to figure out how to move on, carrying both the physical and the emotional wounds that never seemed to heal. And that's really one of the legacies of the Battle of Manila, is that it ripples even today all the way through in the Philippines. Though many of the buildings have been put back together, it left a large sort of generational wound in many families, because it didn't just affect sort of the military age male population. It was grandparents, parents, children. So it really ripped a pretty gaping wound in so many families there. So that's kind of the overall, the photos I've got to show. Happy to take any photos. I think we can figure out how to stop the share. Here, are we back?
Yeah. So one of the
good, exciting, happy Thursday story, I know, right?
Yeah, it's one of those, John Partial in our last talk, he does a sort of spectrum of awful on the decision to use the atomic bomb, and hearing numbers thrown out like 100,000 Filipinos killed through February 1945, and adding to that Okinawa and Iwo Jima in 45 as well, as to some of the thoughts in the planners.
Absolutely. Yeah. No. Yeah. And in fact, actually, you really, in doing research for this book, I was looking at some of the diaries of some of MacArthur's top generals, and one of them, and of course, I can't recall precisely which diary it was at this point, but I distinctly remember one of them writing, is this what we're going to find if we have to go into Singapore and Hong Kong and Tokyo? I mean, because it really was, the first urban battle of the Pacific War. I mean, up until this point, American troops, they'd fought on beaches, they'd fought in jungles, but this gave a glimpse of what it would be like if we had to storm ashore and go into Nagoya, Osaka, Tokyo. I mean, and all the pitfalls involved in urban fighting.
One thing that really comes out in your book is the quick strike to liberate Santo Tomas and the Western civilians that were there. What went into MacArthur's determination of sending in that quick strike, or that flying column?
Well, and it's important to remember, I mean, if the war broke out and the Japanese moved so fast that literally thousands of American civilians, men, women, and children, were trapped in the Philippines and couldn't get out at the beginning of the war. And so Japan had sort of rounded them all up and put them in a bunch of internment camps. And of course, the largest of those was Santo Tomas, which is there in the heart of Manila. At one point during the war, I mean, the population at Santo Tomas was 5,000 people. I mean, it's huge for a 50-acre campus. And you've been there, Nathan, I mean, it's not built as an overnight campus. There were no dormitories or things like that for people. So these internees were really left to themselves to figure out how to turn this campus into a functioning small city, which they very successfully did. But as the economy began to collapse and as the occupation dragged on, and starvation took hold, not just in Manila, it also took place inside the camp. And so you really, on the eve of America's liberation of Manila, 3 to 4 of those American civilians were dying every day in Santo Tomas. And MacArthur was aware of this. I mean, he had intelligence reports coming out. One of them, which said in August of 1944, it said, "It is cheaper to buy a child than it is a hog in the city of Manila today." I mean, they knew how bad the social situation was and the unraveling was. And they definitely got a big glimpse of that a few days earlier when they liberated the survivors from the Bataan Death March at Cabanatuan. And of course, the Army Rangers came in this brilliant strike at the end of January. And these men were so emaciated that one Ranger could carry 2 men out at a time. And so MacArthur knew that it was going to be that way for the civilians, but he also feared what might happen. Would the Japanese kill the civilians, like what had happened at the prison camp in Palawan? What condition were they in? And so he really wanted to get in and to secure the civilians, but also take the legislature and the presidential palace. He went, which of course is the seat of government there. So they had kind of a couple objectives coming into the city there on February 3rd, which was, grab the seat of government, liberate the internees.
We had a question from Chris about General Yamashita and whether he was a scapegoat, and was this execution for humiliating the British in Singapore. And I find Yamashita's journey from 41 through to the Battle of Manila gives a lot of insight into Japanese leadership politics as well. So if you have any comments on Yamashita?
Yeah, no, I mean, he's without a doubt one of the most talented generals that Japan had. I mean, he goes in at the beginning of the war, and for folks who, I didn't really touch on it in my comments that much because he was not inside the city of Manila during the battle. He was the overall army leader in the Philippines at that time that the battle unfolded. Now, he had a pretty meteoric rise at the beginning of the war when he helped defeat the British and in Singapore and Malaysia, and he did it with literally about a third of the forces that the British had. He did it by using the, technologically advanced weapon of the bicycle, in which they had actually taken advantage of England's wonderful infrastructure to bike 700 miles down the Malaysian peninsula and take Singapore. And so he had this great success, and as a result of that great success, he was seen as a rival to Hideki Tojo, who at that time was consolidating his power and everything. So Tojo shipped him off to Manchuria and literally parked him on the sidelines of the war all the way up until 1944. And at that time, after the fall of Saipan, Tojo gets ousted, and Yamashita's career is, of course, resurrected, and he's sent to the Philippines to stop the Americans, literally to turn the Philippines into a tar pit, to bog down MacArthur in the United States in its march north to Japan. And he was really successful with that. I mean, in fact, Yamashita is not actually defeated in battle. He ultimately surrenders in September when he walks out of the mountains. And he did what he knew how to do best at that time. He fought a guerrilla war. He divided up his army, sent them out into the jungles, and to sort of take on the Americans in that capacity. Of course, Yamashita had an easy scapegoat for the destruction of Manila, in that he blamed it on Sanjay Iwabuchi, who was one of his subordinates, who was actually a Navy officer, but was left in the Philippines, was left in Manila to blow up the port and structures and things of that nature that might make the city advantageous for the Americans. But there really was no strategic value in the city of Manila beyond its port. But Iwabuchi, rather than blow up everything and evacuate, ultimately stayed, fortified the city, intent to sort of turn Manila into Stalingrad. Yamashita, when he surrendered at the end, blamed everything on Iwabuchi and said, that he wasn't aware of what was going on. He didn't know about it. But some of the testimony of Yamashita's own subordinates indicated that he was aware of the Battle of Manila as it was going on. He had reports coming in. They did have radio contact and things like that. Also, Yamashita was no stranger to this level of violence. I mean, these kinds of atrocities occurred in Singapore, in Malaysia, when he was victorious there. As many as anywhere between 5 and 50,000 Chinese residents in Singapore, Malaysia were killed. Kiramuda, who was his chief of staff in the Philippines, was there in Nanking. Was one of the principal leaders there during the rape of Nanking. So I mean, even though they didn't have any direct circumstantial evidence to sort of tie him directly to the atrocities. I mean, I think the American investigators and prosecutors felt like they had a pretty good circumstantial case against him, that even without that evidence. Kind of a long-winded answer, but it's a complex, long thing. But I'd tell you, I go into it in a lot of detail in Rampage. So if you haven't read Rampage, I would highly recommend you check it out. But again, I have to say that. So.
Joanne Stratton has a great question going back to Santo Tomas. The nurses, the Angels of Batan. You could talk a little bit about them.
Yeah, so they ended up in Santo Tomas eventually, and of course they sort of led the healthcare and whatnot. And that's one of the fascinating stories, because you don't, when you look at Santo Tomas, and I think in general Santo Tomas is one of the most fascinating stories of World War II, because here you have, by the time it was liberated, 3,700 civilians all thrown into this camp together. Again, just 50 acres, which seems like a lot, but it's really not when you're all packed in there. There was a great sign on one of the bathroom walls, in fact, that said, "If you want privacy, close your eyes." And that was just the reality of living for 3 years on top of one another. But you had people from all walks of life. You had everything from business executives to and teachers to golf pros, photographers, prostitutes, thieves. You had everything from the elderly down to small children. And so they had to really build this society behind these walls, including, schools for kids and hospital systems for everybody. And so that's where the Angels of Batan really came in and played a wonderful role there, is because, they had this great medical experience and whatnot. And so they had to take on this responsibility. And of course, when you're dealing, for 3 years in a situation like this, it's not just starvation at the very end. I mean, you're dealing with kids breaking their arms by playing sports. You're dealing with people getting, diseases, cancer, emphysema, all sorts of healthcare issues. And so, but in the end, of course, when the situation in the camp really begins to deteriorate in that last, 11 months or so, their role gets even more pronounced, because they're then on the front lines of trying to keep these men, women, and children alive. And it's an incredibly difficult experience. I mean, starvation is it's a brutal wasting away of the body, and sort of the, people just the disfiguring, the beriberi, the malnutrition, and of course, then in the end, all those fatalities. So but they were there on the front lines. And then, of course, when the camp gets liberated, people get injured, things like that. They have to spring into battle right at the very beginning, even without having had food in some cases in a day or two, staying up all night, having help care for people. So very remarkable story.
You had mentioned in the comment, your last question, about turning Manila into a Stalingrad. And sometimes I hear of Manila being the Warsaw of Asia in terms of the destruction. But there's a question here. Do you think that the Battle of Manila is overshadowed by other battles like the Marianas Islands or the Solomons? And with that, do sometimes Japan's atrocities get overshadowed by the Germans?
Yes and yes. Those are the short answers. No, I mean, the Battle of Manila, it's surprising how little literature you can find on it. I mean, they're just, and that's kind of what amazed me when I first started picking around the edges of the story when I was beginning to contemplate doing a book on it. You know, I sort of went out to review the existing literature and was stunned to find how little there really was. And of course, you then go into the National Archives and you can find just bankers boxes of documents, and not just the trial testimony and the atrocity accounts, but of course all the various Army and Navy records from the arrival at Lingayen Gulf to the actual battle itself. And of course, it is the only urban battle of the Pacific War that the Americans fought in. And on top of that, you also have this huge American relationship with the Philippines. I mean, this is the only American colony. We build this city in our image. We bring over one of our finest planners to help build this perfect American city. And it's all destroyed in a matter of about 29 days. And so all those things sort of combined, I thought, to make this just truly one of the most fascinating stories of the Pacific War. And yet it totally has been overshadowed. I mean, and you look, I mean, let's be honest, 1945 is an incredibly busy time. I mean, you have, not only do you have the Battle of Manila, you have the beginnings, the B-29 raids that have begun in November 1944 are now about to ramp up into the firebombing attacks. And soon, literally the week after the Battle of Manila ends, Curtis LeMay burns Tokyo to the ground. You've got Iwo Jima, you've got Okinawa, you've got the atomic bomb. I mean, it's just, you've got, Hitler's suicide, the end of the war in Europe. I mean, it's just such a packed time period. And so that's, I think, in part how the Battle of Manila got overshadowed. Do I think that the Germans have had, we know more about their atrocities, and that's been sort of, yes, without a doubt. I mean, the Japanese had, these types of atrocities that happened in Manila, it was not an oddity. I mean, what happened there happened in Nanking, it happened in the wake of the Doolittle raid, it happened after Yamashita's time in Singapore and Malaysia. I mean, these types of things, they follow the Imperial Japanese Army all around Asia, and they really haven't gotten the attention. And that was one of the things I wanted to do with this book, is I wanted to kind of put the spotlight back on that for the story, because I mean, this really is, it's almost less of a military story and more of a civilian story, what happened in Manila. Because I mean, literally 100 civilians died for every one US soldier. And, and they died in these really brutal ways. I mean, it's, they rounded people up and put them in social halls and set the buildings on fire. They, in one of the more gruesome cases, they took 200 men and led them into a house and decapitated them, one right after the other. I mean, these were really brutal, in your face kind of atrocities. Yeah.
So Daniel Siciliano has a question that goes along with this, and it's getting at the core at why were the Japanese officers and soldiers so cruel? So if there's any commentary you have on their mindset or training that goes into this.
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you, there's a really great book, John Dower's War Without Mercy, that sort of examines racism in the Pacific War, and I think there's an undercurrent of that. I mean, I think you have to be able to dehumanize your victim in a lot of ways to do this kind of stuff, and I do think race plays a role in that. And I think that there was a racial undercurrent between Japan and its neighbors over who was superior to the other. And I think that's a role in it. Some people try to say that the Battle of Manila was an orgy of violence. It was spontaneous. I mean, that's simply not true. I mean, the captured battlefield records show that this was an organized massacre of so many of these people. I've read other accounts where people say, well, the Japanese were, the Army has a really rigorous discipline system, and officers are slapping subordinates and things like that, and that just sort of trickles down to the treatment of civilians and whatnot. But there's a huge difference about being slapped around versus, throwing a baby in the air and catching them on the end of a bayonet. I mean, that leap is it's not credible, I think, in my eyes, really. So it really gets down to, I mean, what do you have to be able to do to kill somebody? And I think that's where you have to, it's that dehumanization of your victim. And tragically, it happened over and over again in the Pacific.
So Chris has a follow-up question to this. I know that our relationship with the Philippine government kind of goes up and down depending on priorities and who's in charge. And have you ever come across where the United States has been condemned for embarking on the Battle of Manila and eventually the destruction of Manila?
Yeah, there's still a historical tug of war even today over, who's more responsible for the destruction of Manila. Was it the Japanese or was it the Americans? And Japan is in its post-war time period has actually, they're the number one provider of foreign aid to the Philippines right now. They've really stepped in after the United States left and have sort of cozied up, if you will, to the Japanese. And so, that's the narrative that I think a lot of folks, from Japan's perspective, want to be able to push. That was really the Americans and their artillery that did this. But, and there's no doubt that American artillery played a role in destruction of parts of Manila. But you can also look at the artillery maps and see what the Americans were aiming at. If you look at the artillery files, you see that so much of it was actually aimed at very specific buildings. I mean, about the legislature, the finance building, the agricultural building. Whereas the Japanese were actually systematically destroying neighborhoods. I mean, they set fire to Ermita, Malate. They burned the business district to the north and whatnot. So there's no doubt both countries share a role in it. But I think the larger, more widespread destruction, particularly when you get into the residential areas and things like that, that was more at the hands of the Japanese than, because the Americans were, I mean, literally about 25% of all of our artillery fire was done straight at the walls of Intramuros. So, all targeted at key items versus sort of the random destruction and things like that. And, if you look too, in the wake of the Doolittle raid, for example, I mean, the Japanese did similar tactics in China. They had incendiary squads that went through villages and, you burned every other house in order to create a big enough inferno that it burned all the ones in between. I mean, they understood how to create this kind of destruction. So
another kind of follow-up here. Do you think that Japan's refusal to surrender, is that a cultural thing, or was it due to the necessity to get resources after the oil embargo?
Well, I mean, in Rich Frank's book Downfall does just a wonderful job of sort of really tracking kind of that last year, if you will, and that really the decision to surrender came down to just a handful of people in Japan. And the American submarine blockade had really done so much to bankrupt Japan for all the resources it needed. I mean, they weren't getting any oil in, they weren't getting enough food in. The average caloric intake had dropped down to about 1,600 calories per person. I mean, so much of the damage had already been done, really, even by the time we started firebombing Japanese cities in March of 1945. So really, that by the time Japan surrenders, we've kind of destroyed them twice over. I mean, we cut off all their imports. And then we came in and we burned a lot of their cities. Throughout that whole time period, if you look at the historical record, I mean, what you see and what Hirohito, of course, the emperor, who's the ultimate one who makes the August 15th surrender speech, what he keeps telling people as he's sort of meeting with different, advisors and former statesmen is that we need one more battle. We need one more victory. We need to be able to go to the bargaining table, in order to come out with something, if you will. And because the unconditional surrender was the thing, the United States wanted to be able to come in and lay down the law and be able to exact change. And they were desperately trying to have some sort of last victory in order to increase their bargaining position, really. And that's kind of why it drags out as long as it does. I mean, because they're they've hit their production peak in 1944, and after that, in the summer of 1944, it's all an economic and industrial decline, if you will. And then of course you add the destruction of the cities on top of that. I mean, 50 square miles of Tokyo are eventually burned, 178 square miles of all 66 Japanese cities. I mean, it's just, I mean, it's a mess. I mean, it really is. So,
Yeah. In your presentation, you touched on leading the Philippines toward independence, and that Japan nor the U.S. really wanted to have to pay the bill for the reconstruction of this. Any comments on that quick independence, 1 year later, and how well that worked out in those first few years?
Well, Nathan, you've been to the Philippines and met with folks a lot. That's a question that always comes up too when you're talking to audiences, because it's true. I mean, it's important to remember that the United States, because of the Tides-McDuffie Act in the 1930s, had set independence for the Philippines in 1946 on Independence Day for the United States, July 4th. And so what happens, of course, at the end of the war is that Manila's totally destroyed. And America's like, you know what? We told you guys you're going to have your independence, so you have your independence. And of course, the U.S. then goes on and spends about $12 billion from the Marshall Plan in Europe and helps with the overseeing of the construction of Japan and the sort of the rebuilding of Japan. And so that question always comes up is, well, why didn't the United States kind of help out with, rebuilding in the Philippines? And the U.S. really didn't, and nor did Japan. I mean, I think Japan eventually paid about $600 million in the 1950s, which was just a tiny amount. And then also the U.S. Ended up writing a bunch of creating a bunch of trade deals with the Philippines that were really far more pro-American than pro-Filipinos, kind of handicapped their economy going forward. And so yeah, it's not really one of the finer hours for sort of how America handled that. And particularly because, the United States had this long history with the Philippines. I mean, it was almost half a century of being a colony. Douglas MacArthur had made the moral argument that we shall return because it's what you do. It's sort of, and then, very quickly, I think America kind of moved on. And it's also important to remember too, the post-World War II is it's a very different geopolitical environment. You've got the rise of communism, you've got the Chinese Civil War, the Soviet Union. And so it's a whole different landscape, if you will. But that's a question that always comes up in the Philippines for sure. Great book to read is Stanley Carnell's In Our Image, if you want, that kind of covers the history of the United States and the Philippines.
Now, MacArthur, as controversial as he can be in the United States, doesn't seem to be as controversial in the Philippines. Really had a affinity for the city. Anything you want to say about MacArthur and his legacy in the Philippines?
Yeah, no, I mean, and that's one of the things I love about this story, and because MacArthur is controversial, and he's a fascinating character to write about. I mean, he's this wicked smart guy. He's, grew up sort of with two early helicopter parents, if you will. His dad had been a Civil War hero, Medal of Honor recipient. His mother literally moved to West Point in order to follow him and make sure he stayed on track, and so he kind of spends his whole life, in the shadow of his parents and all. And of course, he's wildly successful. He becomes chief of staff. He's a hero during World War I. He's superintendent at the West Point and all. And then after he kind of retires, he moves over to the Philippines in 1935, and he's given the opportunity to help the Philippines build this modern army. And he takes his mother with him because, he's a grown man. Who doesn't take your mother when you move to the Philippines, right? I mean, and of course he heads over to the Philippines and he meets his wife, his second wife, but really the love of his life on the ship over there. And his mother passes away soon after arriving there, so she dies in Manila. And then he ultimately marries Jean MacArthur, and they have a son. They're living there at the Manila Hotel, and for the first time in his life, he's really happy. He's outside of Washington officialdom. He's had this big career behind him. He stays at home until 10 in the morning. He cruises over to the office, comes home in the afternoons. I mean, he's got this view of the Manila Bay. And for the first time in his life, he's happy. And then of course the war breaks out, and he has to evacuate literally on Christmas Eve. They take off so fast that the Christmas tree is still standing in the parlor of their home. And so the Japanese kind of come in and take all that away from him. So when I hear that, I shall return. I mean, there's a personal undercurrent of that. I mean, no other leaders, for the United States, had their homes taken from them. If you think about it, I mean, Marshall was back in Washington, FDR, I mean, Eisenhower, but for MacArthur, this was personal. And also, if you go to the MacArthur Memorial in Norfolk, they don't have any artifacts that are there from pre-1945 because MacArthur's home is ultimately destroyed in the Battle of Manila, and all is lost. And so, I mean, and of course, the Japanese had come in after they occupied it, and they meticulously um, charted everything, every single item left behind in MacArthur's house. And if you go to the MacArthur Memorial, they had that like spreadsheet from like 1942 down to like how many pocket squares. I think it was like 160 pocket squares. How all the necklaces his wife left. They even recorded how each of his sons' toys, like toy tanks, toy trains, and things like that. So he, I mean, for MacArthur, Battle of Manila and returning to Manila, it was personal. So, and that's one of the things I think that also really kind of makes this such an interesting story. It gives him that personal motivation heading into this battle.
We had a comment from one of the viewers about MacArthur standing next to Hirohito after the surrender, and MacArthur being a very savvy PR type of guy and getting messages out through imagery. So any comments about his time in Japan?
Yeah, no, I mean, in fact, as I recall from that, it's been a few years since I've read on it. I mean, the idea was that he summoned Hirohito too. It was like, who was going to go see whom? It was like, I want to see the emperor. And they're like, well, the emperor will be available on such and such date. And he's like, no, the emperor will come to me. There's a power dynamic here. And, here is the man that the Japanese have looked up to as a god, August 15th, when he does his 4-minute recording of his surrender speech. It's the first time many of them have ever heard the voice of the sacred crane as they describe it. And here he is, the extension of God next to the American general who summoned him and who towers over him. And so there's no doubt about it. MacArthur understood public relations probably better than anybody. In fact, he was the Army's first public affairs officer all the way back during World War I. So I mean, he understood narrative and imagery, and so he got that. I mean, even on Corregidor. I mean, if you go back and you look at all the early communiques that were coming out of the battle there in Bataan and whatnot, I mean, he wrote many of those himself. And of course, he did put himself sort of as the spotlight figure and featured in them all, but there's no doubt that he had a masterful understanding of publicity and public narrative.
And do you know how he's viewed in Japan today? The question that came in from Larry Holman. Is he revered for the democracy and the allowance of keeping the emperor in the imperial family?
Yeah, he is. In fact, it's funny. I was actually trading emails this a couple of years ago, actually, with a Japanese historian, and he was like, I mean, people appreciate MacArthur. They recognize the role he played in sort of helping to reconstruct Japan and things like that. And he's like, they still hate LeMay, which was Curtis LeMay, of course, had burned it all down. So I think within the hierarchy of which American leaders are favored more than others, MacArthur is certainly up there. I mean, he spent 7 years in Japan. He worked out of the national. What's it, the insurance company? The name's of course now slipping me, but he had his office there and and you can actually, his office is still preserved. You can go see the office that he had, and so he helped rebuild. And he they didn't. MacArthur could have been a lot more forceful in sort of the restructuring of Japan than he was, and I think there was an effort to sort of break up some of the powerful industries and sort of and things like that, but they ended up not doing all of that. And so there's no doubt, I think when it comes to the American leaders, he's one of the ones that's more positively viewed.
And you could even do a tour of MacArthur offices throughout Asia Pacific, Brisbane, get to the Manila Hotel, you could be in Corregidor, you get to Japan. So there's a whole series of offices that he's left behind.
Have you been to his redone home in the Manila Hotel, Nathan?
No, it was booked when I was there last.
Okay, I had dinner in it one night, and I hate to spoil it, but they've redone it, and it looks like it was redone by an HGTV television show. It kind of has it like it's like, you know, they've got his study still there and things like that. But in general, you go into the bathrooms and stuff, and it just kind of feels like, you know, HGTV. So
I'd actually came across something that when he was a resident there and he got a nominal place on the board that supervised the hotel, and they gave it to him. It's supposed to be honorary, but he actually sat in meetings to choose like linens and wall coverings and that kind of stuff. That he made it a point to do that.
yeah, well, look, man, you can't be a micromanager if you're not going to know what kind of linens and thread counts you have. So it's a nice hotel, you know, they had to keep it up. But my favorite though is that his, you know, of course, his suite was air conditioned. I mean, of course, and AC back then. I mean, we all live in the South, so we understand the extreme value of air conditioning. His had like one setting that was so cold in there that his wife would actually have space heaters brought in there to sort of counterbalance them. And of course, Eisenhower in the 1930s, when he was his chief of staff, lived a few floors below and didn't have air conditioners. So Eisenhower would come home at lunch. It's so hot in the tropics that he would literally strip down to his underwear to eat his sandwich in his house, while Gene MacArthur's having to use a heater to counterbalance the air conditioner above. I mean, it's just great stuff.
One of the strangest images I found from Corregidor was a fireplace that was in the officers' barracks. And thinking, when would you light a fire in Corregidor?
I will tell you, if you spend the night on Corregidor, the temperature is different out there. It really is. It's a 10-degree change, you know, and at night it's lovely actually. So it is. I think it has kind of its own little weather system, you know, out there than compared to the city. So.
On this point, Larry just chimed in with another question. Did MacArthur's subordinates keep him so busy with distractions to limit those micromanagement tendencies?
Yeah, you know, well, sadly, I think in particular, that's kind of one of the problems with the Battle of Manila is that, you know, when you get somebody like MacArthur, he was surrounded by a lot of yes men. And that's a problem because, you know, coming into the Battle of Manila, for example, there was an early opportunity, I think, for them to recognize what was going on and to sort of, and he was slow to grasp it. And he was slow to grasp it. I mean, he's sitting here planning his liberation parade. You know, he's hell-bent, he's coming back. I mean, they are planning the Jeep assignments. I mean, you know, who's sitting in which Jeep, where the parade's going to go. It's going to go down past his old house and all this kind of stuff. And meanwhile, you know, the Japanese are setting neighborhoods on fire and things like that. And you know, and nobody's willing to tell him, hey, you know, things aren't going like you thought, because he was convinced the Japanese were just going to leave Manila like he did. They were going to declare it an open city, had limited strategic value beyond the port. Why deal with having to fight a battle in a city full of civilians? Just leave. And so, of course, that was not the Japanese plan. And so, but he doesn't figure that out until several days into the battle, and it's actually Bill Dunn, a CBS News correspondent, who's the one who has to be like, hey, you know, they're planning this, they're getting ready to put out a press release about this liberation parade. And he's saying, no, you can't talk about that. I mean, the city's on fire. You're going to look like an idiot. And they're like, you know, because MacArthur wasn't in the city. You know, he's outside the city on this plantation and whatnot. And he's being fed information from his senior folks, and nobody's willing to tell him, hey, it's not going as planned. And so, you know, and similar, you know, in MacArthur, he missed that opportunity, you know, and so.
So one final question here is kind of an overarching one, is the presentation that's not full of many positives, discussing Manila in February 45. Has humanity become less atrocious?
I don't know. Well, probably not. I mean, look at Rwanda. I mean, you know, their genocides didn't stop at the end of World War II. So I doubt it. You know, we have an ability to shine a light on it more through technology and media and things like that. But I mean, these kind of atrocities, they still happen, sadly. Great up note to end on there. I'll add, Nathan. Good job.
Yeah, well, the question that kind of stuck out. But I guess as we're getting ready to sign off, we do a tour together of the Philippines. And once we do get back out there, what's something you're looking forward most to seeing when we get back to Manila?
Yeah, you know, a couple of these. I really can't wait to get back to Corregidor because it's just one of the coolest places on the planet. I mean, it is the Alamo of the Pacific. You know, it is this this island right 27 miles outside of Manila that's carved deep with tunnels, and it's full of ruins. And so it's really easy to imagine what it was like to have been on Corregidor. And one of my favorite places to go, and it's not actually on the tour if you just do the little trolley tour that goes around Manila, but if you get off and you from topside, you go down to the old hospital there, and you've probably been, Nathan, back in there. They still have sinks on the walls and the tiles still on the floors and everything. And it's really easy to imagine what it was like there 75 years ago and all. So Corregidor, it's truly, I think, one of the most haunting, fascinating places on the planet. I mean, it's equal parts Alamo, equal parts Indiana Jones story. I mean, it just kind of all wrapped up into one fascinating place. So that, and of course, I'm always haunted whenever I go out on in Bataan. See the rail car there they have at the where Camp O'Donnell was. I mean, that's just to be able to touch that is just so haunting. So lots of neat places like that. Same in the city. You go into places like De La Salle, and the tile's still the same as it was when the massacre occurred during this Battle of Manila. I mean, it's just, Manila is one of those fascinating places, in the Philippines, around Luzon. I mean, it just, it's ghostly, it's haunting. There's just so many things that are still, you go to the U.S. Embassy in Manila and there's still shrapnel marks on the patio and on the flagpole there. You can still go into the ballroom there where the Yamashita trial took place. You can go sit in the lobby at the Manila Hotel and it looks just like it did, photographs and everything like that from this time period. So it's a fascinating place filled with memories and whatnot from World War II and before.
With that, James, thank you again for your time on this. This is the last of our World War II Virtual Challenge webinars that we'll be doing. We'll continue with some more programming that comes out of our travel department, historians who travel with us. I'll be coming back in September 16th with a British historian, Jonathan Boff, who will be talking to us about the road to Normandy, the why, the when, and the hows of that campaign. So we'll be back with some information on that one in the coming weeks. But again, James, thank you for joining us. And thank you everyone for spending your lunch hour with us as we discuss the Battle of Manila.
Thanks, everyone.